Last year at the end of October, I visited Provincetown, Massachusetts. For those of you who've never heard of Provincetown, it's a beautiful town at the tip of Cape Cod, known for its beachy scenery, wildlife, and it's long been a safe haven for the LGBTQ community as well as home to a lot of local artists. I'd heard a lot about P-Town before, but I hadn't realized it was such an easy trip from Boston. It took only about 90 minutes to get there via the Provincetown Fast Ferry. On the way there, I enjoyed the views from the top deck, although it did get pretty windy. Not long after we reached P-Town and I was already walking away from the ferry, I heard a little commotion behind me, and so of course I had to investigate. This was my first time seeing a seal in real life, and I was super excited, but also surprised by how big he was. It might be hard to tell from the video, but based on the size of his head alone, I would say that Jack was probably about the size of a full-grown adult man.
He's done with us now. Jack's gone. Leave us up to eat.
Jack eventually got bored of us and disappeared under the water, and I decided to start heading downtown. My first stop was the Portuguese bakery, which I'd heard a lot of good things about. I picked up one of their egg custard tarts, which is one of their most popular items, and a coffee. I was underwhelmed by the coffee, which was a little bit too watery for my taste, but I was pretty impressed by the egg tart. It had a perfect buttery crust and a delicious creamy custard filling. As I wandered downtown, I was really struck by how vibrant and colorful everything was. There were a lot of charming little houses with brightly painted facades and beautiful gardens. There were also plenty of souvenir shops and antique stores with various knickknacks on display, and local street art. I could easily see why so many artists have called P-Town home over the years. P-Town is the busiest during the summer months of June and July, and when I went in October, it was pretty quiet. There were still a lot of people wandering around downtown, but I got the sense that most of the tourist activities were pretty much coming to a close. My plan was to continue down the coast and visit some of the little beaches, have some breakfast, and then make my way out towards one of the lighthouses. Finally, I made my way out to the causeway, which is essentially a big pile of rocks that stops the tide from coming in, which plays a critical role in protecting the nearby salt marshes and the local ecosystems. The causeway is about 1.5 miles across. On the other side is the Wood End Lighthouse, which is one of 3 lighthouses in Provincetown. The Wood End Lighthouse was built in 1872, and to my understanding today is no longer in use. That definitely caught my attention, and I knew I wanted to trek out there and check it out. For most visitors, the trip over shouldn't be too difficult, but for small children or those with mobility issues, the large rocks might be a bit of a challenge. At certain points, I had to get a little bit creative and crawl, and also jump over large gaps, but overall it wasn't too bad. When I finally made it to the other side, I was a bit surprised to find myself alone. There were others who had started walking on the other side with me, but they gradually started to turn around and head back, maybe due to fear of being stuck with the rise of the tide, but I was pretty determined to press on and continue to the lighthouse. The rest of the way to the lighthouse was actually trickier than I anticipated. I didn't expect there to be sand dunes for some reason, and for every step that I took, I felt like I was actually taking 2 steps backwards. I ended up being rather tired and was glad that I had brought snacks. It doesn't really come across in the video, but the lighting and the colors looked like something out of a Studio Ghibli movie, and I could hear the sound of the waves crashing along the distant shore. Back at home, I decided to paint the scene. I started with an underpainting. This is a mix of Payne's Gray with a touch of alizarin crimson and some ultramarine. Here, I'm focusing more on tonal values rather than specific hues, so defining areas of shadow while being careful to preserve the whites of the page where I'm trying to capture light in the scene. Now I'm starting to drop in some color, so I'm starting with some warmer hues in the foreground of the scene, and then I'll slowly start to build this up over the course of the painting. For the sky, I'm starting with ultramarine. I think I mixed in a bit of Payne's Gray and a touch of alizarin crimson as well to sort of neutralize the color. Didn't want it to be overly saturated. I am starting to try and paint a little bit more realistically. And so I'm keeping in mind that the sky does tend to be richer and deeper in value in the upper portions and lighter as we get closer to the horizon. So at this stage now, I've started to introduce local color and shadow. Again, because my goal is to paint realistically, I'm avoiding overly saturated hues. So for example, in the shadows of the buildings, rather than using pure black or a pure red, I'm using a mix of burnt sienna with a bit of alizarin crimson. And in the grass, I'm using a similar underpainting approach where I'm thinking more in terms of warm versus cool tones and building up the layers as I continue to paint. As I mentioned earlier, my general approach to capturing light in watercolor painting is to preserve the whites of the page. And this is generally the advice I've heard from other watercolor artists, but in some cases I have been using white gouache, which is basically opaque watercolor, to go back and fill in some of the areas that I may have either covered up with an initial wash, or if I want some additional volume and texture. In the case of clouds, I've been enjoying white gouache as an additional way to express texture and volume. And also, I kind of like the interaction between the transparency and opaqueness. Kind of gives it a bit of this misty quality. For the finer details in the scene, I used a Princeton Velvet Touch round brush, size 1. In these first few months of learning to paint with watercolor, I've noticed that something I tend to struggle with is painting loosely and not getting overly caught up with detail. As I've been editing this video, I noticed that I tend to dab a lot with the brush. Dabbing excessively with the brush tends to result in a painting that looks heavier than desired. Given the transparency of watercolor, most artists painting with this medium tend to avoid that. I'm still very much in the process of learning how to think more in terms of large shapes and to avoid overworking my paintings. Finally, to wrap up the sketch, I'm going back in with my deepest, richest values. So mainly just adding some deeper tones of ultramarine and cerulean to the sky to maintain and emphasize the contrast between the upper portions and the areas near the horizon, as well as adding some final details to the grass and areas near the buildings. So this is the final sketch. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it, but not 100% satisfied. I'll probably repaint it in the future. Overall, I'm still in the process of developing this channel. So this format of travel vlogging and painting is a bit of an experiment in itself. I plan to make more videos like this in the future, so I hope you'll stick around for more adventures like this. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the next video.